Prologue. Welcome back to Dolphin Key. You might know me pretty well by now, but just in case you're a little fuzzy on the details, I'll refresh your memory. My name is Jules Kavanaugh. I'm living the dream down here on the Gulf Coast of Florida. But it took me a minute to embrace it, because I had to lose some skin to get here. As soon as my 2 sons went off to college, my husband of over 2 decades set me free by taking up with his secretary. Yeah, that sounds odd, but by betraying me, he booted me out of a world I'd been slogging through just because it was comfortable. At the time, it was a real kick in the teeth, but everything's worked out much better for me than if I'd stayed in suburbia hell making cheese platters to entertain people I mostly didn't like for a husband who didn't appreciate it. It didn't feel like a favor at the time, but I ended up with paradise, and he got publicly dumped by a ladder-climbing dingbat named Bubbles. Once his whole "I'll leave my wife and we'll get married" thing became a reality, she left him so fast she nearly blew the tires off the new Porsche she'd bought her. Bless the poor thing's greedy little heart. She could have saved herself some time and just asked me to dish about him. But then she wouldn't have gotten the car or the hot up-and-coming attorney she caught with it. When Rob and Bubbles had sat me down and told me how in love they were, he with her perky boobs and she with his imaginary bank account, I suppose, I'd called my 2 besties. Laurel and Cece had shown up 20 minutes later with the fixins for margaritas. We'd gotten drunk and hatched an outrageous plan right then and there, with the clarity only tequila can bring. We'd decided I'd pack my bags that night and move to the place my father had left me in Florida, sight unseen, the next morning. Crazy, right? But let me tell you, it was the best thing I've ever done. My estranged father had just passed away, leaving me the owner of his tiki bar. It sits right on the Gulf of Mexico, and I get to listen to steel drum music and stare at the ocean from the back deck of the apartment upstairs. I own my own successful business on the Gulf of Mexico. I work the schedule I want, and I answer to nobody. I'd needed a job, a place to live, and a safe space to regroup and find myself, and my inheritance had solved all my problems at once. I realize my story sounds relatively normal so far. Sure, life threw me a curveball, and that's just part and parcel of being human. Shit happens. You pick yourself up and you go on. I did that by moving here, and that's when the other details of my new life left normal in the dust, but in a very cool way. Well, except now people keep trying to kill me, and as the mistress of balance, I'm responsible for maintaining the balance between good and evil. Details, though, right? The night I moved here, I had an awakening, and I mean that quite literally. My flair for the dramatic, combined with a spell that I mistook for a poem to activate magic I hadn't even known I possessed. That's only the tip of the iceberg, though. A gorgeous alpha wolf shifter was managing my bar and took me under his wing when I almost destroyed it by accidentally summoning a mini hurricane while I was arguing with the ex on the phone. We hit it off, and now he treats me like a goddess, at least when he's not being a boneheaded man. Eddie and Eric, 2 of my new friends, keep me laughing and have taught me a ton about magic. But maybe the biggest shocker in all of this was finding out I have a sister named Delilah, or Lila for short. Our relationship is messy, but we're getting there. She did sort of try to kill me, but just the one time. To be fair to her, she's also saved me more than once, too. We're doing the best we can to work through our differences, but families are hard. To summarize, I've been thrust into a whole new world that I hadn't even suspected existed outside of my fantasy books. My life is filled with magic and mayhem, shifters, elves, fairies, hellhounds, and mystical portals. I even met a sea serpent who had the kindest heart once she stopped trying to smash us. I'm fortunate to have friends, both old and new, by my side, so I don't have to go on this journey alone. The whole situation has been surreal, and despite 2 excellent efforts by 2 different factions, I've lived to tell another tale, and I'm glad you've decided to join me. Now that you're all caught up, let's get to the story. Chapter 1. That should do it, I said, plucking the drain from the sink and then drying my hands. Apart from the full tip bucket, the night had been bananas from a bartender's perspective, but the business owner in me was jumping for joy. Since I'd taken over, we'd made a few minor changes to the way the bar ran, such as featuring live music on weeknights, but the return on investment was huge. I think the band was a hit, Ronan said, wiping off the last bit of stickiness from the bar. The steel drums were a nice touch. And people seem interested in the Halloween party next weekend, too. I wasn't sure how that would go down. Where I'm from, people take their kids out trick-or-treating, but adults don't dress up unless it's for a charity event. Even then, it's usually just masks. He shot me a look of disbelief. That's the fun of Halloween. You have one night to be whatever you want to be. I smiled as I thought of the soccer moms I'd known dressing up as cheerleaders and scarecrows. Hell would have frozen over first. Yeah, but it's not dignified. I heard Eddie and Eric talking about dressing up as Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble. I'll bet you $100 they come up with some way to make their costumes tropical. He laughed as he slipped clean wine glasses into the overhead rack. I'm not taking that bet. They keep whoever makes those Aloha shirts in business. I have no doubt they'll find caveman versions of them. The visual made me laugh as I closed the cooler and dumped out the sanitizer buckets. If you're about finished up, I'll go ahead and count the drawer so we can call it a night. I am. You're certainly getting the hang of this whole bartending thing, he said, as he stacked the last of the clean beer glasses in the freezer. If I didn't know any better, I'd swear you'd been doing this all your life. I shrugged as I pulled the cash drawer from the register. Well, I did bartend my way through college, so I guess a lot of it's just muscle memory. The more I do it, the more stuff comes back to me, I snickered. It helps that if I forget how to make one of the fluffy tropical drinks, I can just use the standard rum, pineapple juice, OJ, and a blurb of grenadine. Maybe toss in some coconut rum for a little extra flair. Ronan grinned and wiped his hands on a dry towel, then pulled me into a hug. That's cheating, but I'll allow it considering how full your mental processor must be right now. You can always ask for the recipe through our link, but as long as the guest's happy, that's all that matters. I'm gonna go grab a couple bottles of tequila from the stockroom while you chain the chairs. I hugged him back, then pushed up on my tippy toes to give him a kiss. I'd only meant for it to be a quick peck, but it slipped from G-rated to PG and was racing around turn 3 toward R when I pushed him back and cleared my throat. Maybe you should go get that tequila so we can continue this upstairs. Yes, ma'am, he replied with a wink and one more quick kiss on the tip of my nose, before heading toward the front building 100 yards away. It was technically an inside bar area, but we didn't use it. According to Ronan, it was mostly for hurricane parties or the rare occasion when it got really cold. Since neither had happened since I'd been there, I'd never seen it open. Instead, we used it for storage. I'd only slipped the security chain through 2 of the chairs when a noise that sounded suspiciously like a metal spoon hitting the floor sounded from the kitchen area. Brutus, my demon dog, posing as a half-grown French bulldog puppy, growled from where he was splooting on the cool patio bricks, and the hackles on his little back stood on end. Hang on, boy, I said, tilting my head and waiting to hear another noise. Since I was already squatting, I maintained my position so that I was invisible from the bar. It was a little windy outside, so it was possible a sea breeze had blown through strong enough to knock a utensil off the hook. Not probable, though, and the thought flew right out the window when something bumped into the stainless steel prep table. I recognized the sound because I'd done it myself a dozen times before I'd acclimated to where everything was. A faint groan reached my ears, and I glanced toward the front of the building to see whether or not Ronan was on his way back. Obviously, there was somebody in the kitchen, but I was loath to face it alone. I had a metric shit-ton of magic and a demon dog who could eat a man whole, but I wasn't one of those stupid women from a horror movie who went to investigate things on her own. In my world, doing something like that could get you killed, just like in the slasher films. No matter how powerful you are, there's always somebody more powerful, or, in my case, more experienced. Instead, I reached out to Ronan through our mental link. Somebody's in the kitchen. I needn't have bothered telling him. Being an alpha wolf shifter meant he had a sixth sense for danger anyway, and when it came to me, he was especially protective. He was already halfway across the courtyard that separated the tiki from the front building. When he stopped at the corner of the bar in order to stay hidden, he put his nose in the air and sniffed, then narrowed his eyes. Brutus growled again. Whispering a few words, I threw up an invisible physical barrier around the three of us. Though I could technically do the spell without speaking the words now, I still wasn't in the habit of doing so. "Stay here while I check it out," he said, through our link. "Not a snowball's chance in hell," I replied. "I'm going with you." A couple of months ago, I'd have been a liability, but that wasn't the case anymore. I'd gotten a decent hold on my magic, so I wanted to be there in case things went sideways. He breathed a deep, annoyed sigh, but didn't try to persuade me further. As an apex predator, he was stealthy. Unlike me. Just the sound of my knees popping when I stood up probably gave us away if the trespasser didn't already know we were there. I sent out magical feelers for any beings in the bar, and sure enough, I found one person, a wizard to be exact, back there. "There's one wizard back there," I thought to Ronan. "I know, and I smell blood," he whispered aloud as he stepped around the corner in a semi-crouch ready to pounce. I slipped in beside him and almost tripped over a soft lump on the floor before I could even hit the light switch. I leapt back a few feet and swished my hand to turn on the lights. As soon as I could see, I realized the lump was a man with a gash on his forehead. He groaned again, and though he appeared to be out of commission, I didn't make the mistake of just assuming. I summoned my magic, ready for him to jump up and attack as I approached him. Brutus stood tight against my leg, growling with his hackles up. Ronan placed a hand on my arm, holding me back as he pushed the man onto his back with his toe. I gave him a once-over. On top of the gash, his clothes were singed, but not badly enough that it would have burned through to his skin. For that matter, the cut hadn't put him in the shape he was in either. Face wounds bleed a lot, but my maternal superpower for quickly scanning for mortal wounds had already catalogued it as superficial. I glanced at Ronan, who bent over the guy and lightly slapped the side of his face. "Wake up, buddy. You have some explaining to do." There were only two ways the dude could have gotten into the kitchen without passing me. Through the back door, which would have required either jumping the fence around the dumpster or teleporting in. Either way, I didn't know him from Adam, and it was almost 3 a.m. He'd better have a damn compelling reason for being there. The guy cracked his eyes open and blinked a couple of times. "I need the mistress of balance," he croaked, pushing up to a seated position with his back braced against the table post. I stepped closer. "Who's asking?" I wasn't about to just declare my identity to some random wizard who'd shown up in my bar in the middle of the night. The whole situation was sketchy, and I was no dummy. He winced as he used the table to climb to his feet. "Blaine Thatcher. I need help. Sanctuary, actually." Sanctuary from what? I asked. The situation had taken a turn for the weird. I wasn't a shelter, but I would protect somebody who needed it, depending on the circumstances. Are you the mistress? He asked, giving me the once-over. I imagined somebody... I quirked a brow at him and crossed my arms. Younger? In better shape? There was no shame in my game, but I also knew I had a few wrinkles and a little extra padding despite the rigorous training I'd been doing. His face pinked, and he shifted his gaze from mine. I'm sorry, that was rude, and I spoke without thinking. I'd heard your situation was unique, so I don't know what I was thinking. I was almost murdered beside my friend less than 5 minutes ago, so I'm not exactly thinking straight. Explain, Ronan clipped. He had his arms crossed and his feet shoulder-width apart, which made him look moderately terrifying, even to me. Given the situation, I wouldn't have asked him to soften his stance, even if I thought he would have listened. Blaine rubbed his head, wincing when he touched the cut. I was walking on the beach in L.A. with a friend. The weather was great, the water was calm. I hadn't seen him in a while, so we were catching up. I admit, I wasn't paying much attention to our surroundings, so our attacker caught us by surprise. 1 minute we were alone, and the next, somebody was firing lightning at us. My friend took a direct hit, but I managed to avoid the one aimed at me. He glanced down at his scorched clothing. Barely. Ironically, we'd been talking about you and what's been going on, and wondering why you haven't done anything about it, so this is where I came. I furrowed my brow in confusion. What are you talking about? What's been going on, and why should I be doing something about it? He glanced at me, puzzled. You mean you really don't know? About what? I glanced at Ronan to see if he had any idea what this guy was talking about. He shook his head. Blaine closed his eyes. Fine. I don't know why that's a shock. You've only had this position for a couple of months, and you haven't even held a coven meeting. Not that I blame you, but this is sort of one of the jobs where you must be able to keep a lot of balls in the air. I scowled, but it was mostly because he'd hit a sore spot. I'd been meaning to talk to the local coven leader about that, but just hadn't found the time. Or so I told myself. Brutus shoved his nose into my hand and whined. He always seemed to know what I was feeling. Blaine held up a hand. Let me start at the beginning. As I'm sure you know, a lot of magicals choose to live quiet lives. We're not interested in politics, and we don't care about power. All we want to do is live and let live. Problem is, when you're not part of any group, it takes a long time for somebody to notice you're missing, even if you check in like you're supposed to. Before I visited Charles, I'd stopped in to check on my friend Barbara. She lives in LA too, and I hadn't heard from her in a while. I got to her place, and she was just gone. I couldn't sense her magic there at all, not even residual traces that would have let me know she'd been there recently. That's when I called Charles. So, what do you think happened to her? Isn't it possible she just moved and didn't let you know? I asked. He shook his head. All of her stuff was still there. Even her grimoire was in her secret hiding spot. We used to spend holidays together, so I know where she kept it. There's no way she would have left without taking at least that with her. I have the gift of tracking. I can find pretty much anybody anywhere, and I couldn't catch a hint of her anywhere, no matter how hard I tried. I thought I had once, but I was wrong. Okay, Ronan said, scratching his stubble. So, how does that lead you to almost dying tonight? Blaine pulled in a deep breath and blew it out through pursed lips. A shadow crossed his face, and he shuddered. Charles and I went out to dinner, and I asked him about Barbara. They stayed in touch more than she and I did, so I figured he might know something. When he paused for a few seconds, the suspense was about to kill me. I rolled my fingers to get the story moving again. Well, had he heard from her? Blaine shook his head. No, he hadn't talked to her in a couple of weeks, which was odd. He'd left a few voicemails when she stopped answering his texts, but she never returned his calls. Okay, so the two of you were walking on the beach and you were attacked? Ronan asked. Yeah, Blaine replied, gingerly touching the cut on his head. We were just strolling along, then this figure appeared 20 yards or so ahead of us. Before you ask, I have no idea if it was a man or a woman, or if it was even a human. They were wearing a long black cloak. I couldn't even see a face. His expression was haunted, and his gaze was far away. Before I could barely even register its existence, it raised its arms and started throwing lightning at us. He hit Charles first, though it did graze me. I instinctively bent down to check on him, which is how I avoided the magic they aimed directly at me. The weird part is that Charles disappeared before he even hit the ground. So how did you end up here? I asked, leaving that last part alone for a minute while my brain processed the rest. We've never met. I've never seen you in the bar. As far as I know, you can't teleport someplace you've never been. Despite the gravity of the situation, one corner of his mouth curled up into a small, wry smile. That tracking gift I was talking about? I've seen plenty of pictures of this place, and I knew exactly where it was at. Plus, all I really had to do was focus on you. I've been around for a few hundred years, and I've gotten adept at both teleporting and tracking people. I've never had much use for the tracking part, but it has come in handy a few times throughout my life. I don't usually get quite so close, but this time I got lucky. I don't think I could have walked far. His story sounded logical, but it wasn't the only explanation. How do we know you didn't kill him yourself and get a little beat up while you battled? I'd learned many moons ago that you couldn't just assume somebody was telling the truth. Dealing with PTA parents, soccer moms, and slick executives had finally honed my ability to sniff out bullshit. But as my marital experience had proven, my gut wasn't infallible. I wasn't sensing anything from this guy, but I was reserving judgment. He shrugged, then winced at the movement. You don't know anything about me, so I can respect the suspicion. In fact, I'd be a little worried if you just took what I'm saying at face value. Nobody fit to lead would. So, to answer your question, I can teleport, obviously, and nobody relevant saw me with him that night. You'd have never heard my name, even if you did eventually work it out. Ronan was about to pace a path on the floor. So why come to us? I get that you think your other friend's absence is odd, but isn't it possible she went to visit other friends or something? She could have packed a small suitcase, and maybe she didn't want to risk taking her grimoire with her if she didn't need it. Blaine used the table to pull himself to his feet. Because weird things have been happening over the last few weeks. She's only the second disappearance that I've heard of, but a couple of shifters died last week. Since they were together, we just wrote it off as a weird fluke that happened while they were out running. I mean, they were mated, so it would make sense that if lightning struck one, they could have been touching and they both got juiced. But with what happened tonight, it doesn't sound so easy to write off. But they didn't disappear like Charles did? I asked. It did sound suspicious, but why would the killer take one body but not the others? At the mention of shifters, Ronan's gaze sharpened. I could feel his anxiety and a wave of alpha rage through our link. Because, unlike people with magic, shifters wouldn't have sensed the spell when they were gathering the remains. They'd have taken the deaths at face value and not questioned it. He turned back to Blaine. What kind of shifters were they? Bears, Blaine replied. If you think about it, the deaths taken on their own without the context of the other magicals kind of makes sense. They're bears. Bears climb trees, and trees get struck by lightning. It stormed that week, so it wasn't entirely noteworthy. Ronan growled at the guy's apparent lack of sympathy. Blaine huffed out a frustrated breath. I didn't mean it that way. They just wouldn't have stood out without Barb disappearing and Charles and me being attacked. We've also heard whispers of other disappearances, which is what we were talking about. Again, they weren't really of note until you start stringing it all together. There are semi-rational reasons some of them would fall off the map. They might have gone to visit family, or maybe they went on a trip. Most of them were loners, so it's not like they left gaping holes in the local social structure. He rubbed a hand over his face and did his best to straighten his ruined clothing, then turned to me. I wasn't sure about coming here. Rumors have spread about your sister's desire to have your position. If things go her way, dealing with you could make for a tougher life for me. Up until now, she hasn't even been a blip on anyone's radar, but when she took up with Drake, that changed things. He's been power-hungry for decades, but could never rally any serious forces. Your sister's smart, and she also has a legitimate connection to you and to the necklace. That gives Drake an ace in the hole, and made it easier for him to gather people to support his bid. My mind raced, trying to make the pieces fit, but they weren't quite lining up. So, how does this all connect? And as far as my sister goes, don't worry about her. I'm not going anywhere. It connects because it's happened before, Ronan replied. Remember the story of your necklace? Everybody knows about that, and when magicals start disappearing, it's not hard to make the connection, especially now that he witnessed Charles's murder. One witch disappearing stands on its own. 2 bear shifters getting struck by lightning isn't outside the realm of possibility, as Blaine explained. But when you put all of it together, especially when there are whispers of other disappearances, it's a big red flag. We need to find out what's going on. There was no way I was letting Blaine in the apartment before I knew for a fact that he wasn't lying. I'd warded the place so heavily that the door to my living quarters wasn't even visible. The only people who knew it was there were people Ronan or I specifically invited, assuming they hadn't known about it before I warded it. I sighed. I have a safe space for you, but you need to let me do a truth spell. I won't invade your privacy without your permission, but I won't just invite somebody in who might want to kill me. I have enough of those types already. He nodded. Do what you have to do. I just want my friend avenged, and I want to know what happened to Barbara. I think he added that part out of some sort of unrealistic hope, but I'd let him have it for now. I uttered the words that would prevent him from lying to me. We'd tested the spell quite thoroughly, and as long as I asked pointed questions with yes or no answers, it was reliable. Was your friend murdered by lightning while you were walking on the beach tonight? He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He was. And did you kill him? I asked, glancing at the ring the oracle had given me. It was the same clear blue it always was, rather than the milky purple it turned when I was in the presence of somebody trying to pull shenanigans. I did not, he replied. This time he made direct eye contact with me, and even without the spell, something deep inside told me he was telling the truth. Did you see the person who killed him? I saw a being throwing lightning, and I saw Charles get hit, but I didn't see the actual person. They were cloaked. Do you have any idea what happened to your friend Barbara? He drew his brows together. I have an idea, but I don't know for a fact. I think she died the same way Charles did. I glanced at Ronan. Do you have any questions? I do, he said as he stepped closer to Blaine. Do you mean Jules, Mistress of Balance, or any of her guard, harm? Do you understand that if you try to hurt her, I'll make sure you die a grisly death? Blaine's brows shot up. Wow, you don't beat around the bush, do you? No, I don't mean any harm to Jules or anybody else. Except, of course, the people who killed Charles. And yes, it's quite clear that you'd kill me most unpleasantly. Anything else? I asked, and Ronan shook his head. I need to heal him, I told Ronan through our link. No, he thought back to me. Healing takes a lot of energy out of you, and you might need that before the night's over. There's nothing wrong with him that some rest won't cure. Even though I felt bad for not offering to help, Ronan was right. I could draw energy from the earth, but it took a toll. Whatever I touched died, and the landscaping bill for the bar was already hefty enough. Plus, healing's a valuable gift, so it's one I preferred to keep to myself. I sighed as I considered the situation, as if my sister's radio silence wasn't worrisome enough. Now we might be facing another enemy. I don't know why I was surprised, because that seemed to be the story of my new life. Satisfied for the moment that Plain wasn't there to cause trouble, I did what the mistress of balance and any good southern hostess would have done. I took him upstairs and gave him shelter.